Welcome to DSA's continuing Engage series. This is the DSEF Insights portion of our show. I'm Gary Huggins, Executive Director of DSEF. Thank you for joining us. Really appreciate having you. Before we get started, I want to talk about the slide that is before everyone. Important DSEF events that we hope you'll all participate in. Particularly want to talk about one tomorrow, where we will have DSEF Fellow Dr. Ann Coughlin from Northwestern University leading a discussion among DSEF and DSA board members about what constitutes consumer harm in voluntary business arrangements. Really important topic to the industry and for the industry. Ann's done some fascinating research and writing on that topic, sort of a leading thinker in the country on that topic. So look forward to that conversation and hope that all of you will join us and listen into that interactive discussion that will be happening as well. Also call your attention to the Direct Selling Day on Capitol Hill in September. It's a different way of having your voice heard, but we need to make sure that on behalf of the industry, your voice is heard in that important event. Also, the Legal and Regulatory Seminar, for those who are interested in that, is coming up in October. So in the chat function will be links to sign up for all of those, register for all of those events. We encourage you to do that or visit the DSA website, and you can avail yourself in that way. So please join us. Before we start, I just want to say a quick word or two about the DSEF Fellows Program. Many of you have been with us on previous broadcasts, and you know that we've partnered with 250 academic leaders across the country who do research and provide insights and expertise about the industry, to the industry, for the industry, and that's been kind of the important part of the conversations we've hosted during this Insights series. In addition to doing that research that contextualizes, explains, and paints an accurate picture of the industry, those insights provide help as we go through the pivots and changes and challenges that we've all had before us in recent months. Also, through our Fellows Program, we've reached over 150,000 students nationwide with content about direct selling. It's part of the college curriculum now, those studying businesses in various parts of business studies, ethics, entrepreneurship. So our fellows have played a really important part in making that happen, and we appreciate that partnership as well. With regard to today's conversation, we've got Dr. Michael Solomon from St. Joseph's University. Dr. Solomon will be familiar to many of you. He's keynoted at DSA events. He's been a contributor in a lot of DSEF hosted discussions at those events as well. Also active in our research. He spent some time in Dallas with a group of 21 of his fellow colleagues, mapping out a course of important research on behalf of the industry and to serve the industry. So really glad to have Dr. Solomon with us today. I'll do a quick introduction. He's an expert and author and trend analyst in the fields of consumer behavior, retail, fashion, merchandising, brand, and social media. Professor of marketing at St. Joseph's University in Philadelphia. He's also frequently quoted in major outlets such as the New York Times, USA Today, Adweek, and Time, and is a regular contributor to Forbes. He writes in Forbes about the minds of consumers and what influences them to buy. His most recent article is titled Consumer Behavior in the New Normal, which of course is very relevant to the conversation that we'll have today. In fact, we'll put that article up in the chat function, a link to that article, forgive me, up in the chat function so that you can get that and read it after we've been through this conversation. But really look forward to talking to Mike and kind of hearing his thoughts on what history teaches us about consumer behavior changes in past challenging times. You can think about the previous pandemic, you can think about recessions, wartime, 9/11. He'll talk about opportunities and challenges for direct selling in this dramatically changed landscape that we find ourselves in. He'll talk about consumer behavior trends since the onset of the pandemic that we're currently dealing with. He'll also talk about what the outlook will look like in 3 to 6 months in his opinion. So really looking forward to that. Mike, welcome.
Hey, thanks, Gary. Thanks for having me on, and a quick shout out to you and Kimberly for the great job you do with the Fellows Program. It's been a terrific experience for me. Really
Thank
appreciate
you,
it.
Mike. We're so proud to have you be a part of it, and you've been such an asset to the foundation and to the industry at large. So we appreciate that very, very
Thank you.
much. And I want to remind all that this presentation is going to be recorded. So we encourage you to share this with your colleagues, share this with your sales force. Beyond our interactive conversation today, we think there's a lot of value to what Mike's going to share with us. And to that point of interactive conversation, I want to encourage you all to use the Q&A function and ask questions as we go along, whatever occurs to you. Mike's prepared some really interesting thoughts for us, and I think should provoke some good conversation among all of us. So why don't we dive right in? I have a question. When we're not sitting around on Zoom calls or learning to be homeschoolers, some of us better than others, or worried about our health or finances, we think about what it's going to be like in the next 6 months to a year. Mike, I'm curious, what have we learned from previous crises? I mentioned earlier this history that you follow with wars, recessions, pandemics, what have you. What can that tell us in identifying future trends?
Yeah, great question. Before I jump in, let me confirm that you can see my slides, correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay, great. Because that wouldn't be part of the new normal that I want if you can't see. All right. Well, yeah. So what can we learn from the past? And of course, everybody's wondering how are we going to cope with this so-called new normal? And it's a huge question, obviously. To begin with, there are lessons that we can learn from the past, and everybody has probably seen this famous quote about what happens when we forget about the past. So when we think in psychology and when we study marketing and consumer behavior, one of the things to keep in mind is that the best single predictor of future behavior is past behavior. Doesn't mean it's perfect, doesn't mean every situation is the same, but in the absence of anything else, you always want to start by looking into the past, trying to find some reasonably similar situations and just see what people did, because, people are people, whether they were consumers 100 years ago or 10 years ago, what have you. And when I started to do that, it was fascinating. Most of us really, until this mess started, didn't know much about past pandemics other than maybe the bubonic plague or something like that. And what you're seeing here are some ads that, to me, I was blown away because I feel like these could appear today. And all of these, as you might guess, are from the 1918 influenza epidemic. And lo and behold, you've got the same concerns about mask wearing and social distancing and so on. So hopefully we can learn from that experience. And of course, at least to date, many, many more people died in 1918 than have so far today. So hopefully we'll be a lot more successful at learning from the past. Another thing that we can learn, there was a great article in the New York Times in April having to do with social distancing, and is it worth intervening and so on. And I won't dwell on this, but I encourage anyone who's interested to go back and take a look. And basically what they did very simply was to look at how American cities reacted in 1918 in terms of how proactive they were in terms of encouraging social distancing and things like that. And lo and behold, as you can see in this figure here, there was some pretty solid evidence that it works, that the economies of cities that were more aggressive actually fared better in the long term. Maybe they hurt more in the short term. But when you look in the lower left, and I'm coming to you from Philadelphia, and we're down there, way down in the lower left, not a good thing. And so maybe we can take some lessons from that in kind of a macro sense. And of course, we had a more recent catastrophe, not a health catastrophe, but an economic one called the Great Recession about 10 years ago, a little more. And that's obviously instructive to look at as well. How did people react? Of course, they didn't have to worry about wearing masks and things like that, but but lots of us did have dramatic changes to our income, not in a good way. So it's interesting to go back to see what some of those changes were. And I won't go through a lot of them, but one I thought was kind of interesting, and I'll tell you why. I found some data that McKinsey published in 2009. And they were looking at how people changed in terms of their willingness to buy the higher price spread, so to speak, brand loyalty and so on. And sure enough, as you might expect, when people's incomes are threatened, many of them tend to downgrade. They're looking suddenly for cheaper alternatives. And what's interesting here is, and I'm going to come back to this point. About a third of the people who switched, who made this change that they were reluctant to do before, decided, you know what, this isn't so bad. This lower priced product that I'm buying actually works just as well, and those premium brands are not worth the money. So that's definitely something to think about. And the reason I said I'm going to come back to that, I'd like to give everybody kind of a metaphor that I find very useful as a way to sort of wrap your brain around how to think about change and people's willingness or reluctance to change in situations like that, what we're seeing here. And this is a framework that was actually proposed by a social psychologist, a very influential one named Lewin, back in 1948. And what Lewin said was that, basically when we talk about how do we get people to change their behavioral patterns, because let's face it, most of us are very stubborn. We're set in our ways. We will make changes, but we often need a really good reason to do so, because overall, we know when we study consumer behavior, you've got to give people a good reason to exert the effort, to think about, for example, changing the brands that they buy or the behaviors that they do. So what Lewin said was, think about behavior, and this framework is usually used to understand change in organizations, but I think it works in our culture as well. Think about behavior and the things that we do as like a block of ice, right? And so you have this frozen water that's frozen into a certain shape, and it's really solid, right? Obviously. And that is a good representation of consumer behavior, because for the most part, once people are locked into a certain pattern, they have their favorite brands, they have their favorite way of doing things. As any upstart, as any challenger brand knows, it's very, very difficult to get people to consider making a change. But now something happens. Maybe we could talk about climate change, melting the ice, I don't know. But something happens where, so to speak, the temperature rises, and now that ice starts to melt. And that's what's happening to us now. We have this major, significant event that is forcing what we call an unfreezing. Now, what happens during an unfreezing is that what once was solid now becomes fluid or liquid. And this is, for the most part, a bad thing. Nobody is happy about where we are. But it is also a point of opportunity for a lot of companies, for a lot of marketers. It was initially Winston Churchill who basically said, never waste a good crisis. And what we mean by that here is that when we're confronted by a crisis, it unfreezes us and it forces us to consider ways of doing things that we hadn't considered when we were in that equilibrium state. So we start to unfreeze, and now suddenly things that we just took for granted before, the way we did things, something as simple as shaking hands when you meet somebody, these things now get called into question. That is when change happens. That is when opportunities occur. And so we make these various changes, and what that means is we have a window where we can create new interventions, new habits, and so on. That window does not last forever, because at some point there will be a refreezing. Hopefully in our situation, that means a return to normality, whatever that means. You know, we have a vaccine, et cetera, that everybody hopes for. When we refreeze, now that block of ice is going to be in a different shape. So the water's still going to be there, but now the ice is going to be in a different shape. And what that means is that in that so-called new normal that everybody's talking about, people are back to preferring their habitual way of doing things, but those things have now changed. And so from a marketing perspective, whether you're a direct seller or any other kind of marketer, this is that opportunity to become part of that change before we refreeze. And we hope that we refreeze quickly, but we clearly have that little window here where we can start to make or to see some serious changes in people's habits. So what tends to happen is when you have a crisis like this, we've been talking for years, well before this virus hit, about market disruptions, about various changes that are fundamentally altering the way we think about markets, whether it's the gig economy that direct sellers love to talk about, something like that, that's a market disruption. What the pandemic does is it throws fuel on that fire. In other words, it exacerbates fault lines that were already there. So changes that were bubbling up in society but hadn't quite really just taken off yet. Perhaps this is, so to speak, the final straw. I know I'm mixing a lot of metaphors in here, but this is sort of the final straw where we see a lot of things that were about to happen suddenly are going to happen much quicker as we get this unfreezing going on. So here's an example, another headline from the New York Times. So, we've been talking about automation now for a number of years, the good things, the bad things, apprehensions about losing jobs to automation, et cetera. Robots welcome to take over as pandemic accelerates automation. So there's an example where maybe a lot of people, not everyone, but a lot of people who had misgivings about the advent of automation, let's say at retail or in manufacturing, now are suddenly willing to accept that to a much greater degree. Because let's face it, robots don't, robot software gets viruses, but not this kind of virus, right? So suddenly people are more receptive to that. Now in the direct selling space, depending, this is a good thing or a bad thing depending on your philosophy. Based on what I'm hearing, and I know Gary, you're hearing the same thing. What it's done is to accelerate, I think, the movement of a lot of direct sellers toward more online activity. And companies that were kind of teetering or that had just stuck a toe in the water are now forced to really submerge themselves into that change. And so this, again, creates an opportunity if you're part of that change. If you're not part of that change and you're resisting it and you're a direct seller, you're probably going to run into some problems when that water refreezes. So those are two quick examples of changes that were kind of looming, but are probably accelerating right now. And just a quick plug here, don't worry, I'm not trying to sell a book, nobody panic. I published a book about some of these disruptions and fundamental changes in consumer behavior about a year ago. At the end of this presentation, if anyone's interested, I'll give you information if you'd like to get a free e-file of that book. I'd be happy to send it to you. But in that book, I talk about some of these fundamental assumptions that we make about our customers and why those no longer apply. So going forward, everybody seems to have their own perspective on what's going to happen. And lots of people are sort of prognosticating about the future. I don't have a crystal ball. If you think that someone does, then I've got a bridge to sell you, because nobody really knows what's going to happen. But we can make some educated guesses. But it's fascinating to see that these guesses can go in wildly divergent directions. So, for example, there was an article I found in Women's Wear Daily early in April, where they were kind of looking at what is the future going to be, reading the tea leaves, it was called. And there were two people quoted in there, actually more than two, but there were two kind of prominent futurists quoted in there. And what was fascinating is that in the same article, these two people made the exact opposite predictions. Now, I'm not going to use their names here because I don't want to embarrass them. But the first one says it's going to be a catastrophe, basically. You know, what it means is because of the income ramifications, our biggest choices are which credit card bill do we pay? You know, it's going to be that dire. So not a very positive thing. In the same article, the futurist number two, who's very well known, says this is going to be awesome. You know, this is going to be, maybe get that Mercedes they always wanted. In the aftermath, once the dust settles, we could see a period of rampant consumerism. So, you know, which is the case? Are either of them correct? Again, I'm not really sure, but one thing that I can possibly predict is that both of them are right in at least one way. And that is, and this is a basic consumer issue that I want to focus on, you know, in our conversation. How can we accommodate our desire to get out there, especially after lockdown and all that, you know, to suddenly be happy again and get things and all that when we're hurting, you know, when a lot of people are hurting. So let's go back to the Great Recession. And what we found there is that, and I'm going to focus on a category here. I don't know if there are any direct sellers in ice cream, Gary. Maybe there are, but I don't know of any. But
I know, yeah.
but nonetheless,
That'd be a very short party plan.
Yeah, right. A lot of dry ice, you know. But when you look at data about what people did in terms of buying ice cream during the Great Recession, what you see is that sales went through the roof. And not only did people buy a lot of ice cream, but they bought premium brands. They didn't buy the discount brands. And my interpretation of this is that this is a way to get what I'm calling a guilty pleasure. In other words, so to speak, have your cake and eat it too, or have your ice cream and eat it too, because I can at least splurge on great ice cream, even if I can't, you know, go on that vacation or buy that Mercedes. So I think that one of the things for maybe for some direct sellers who are listening is to think about how can you supply what we might call accessible indulgences to your customers. Another lesson we can learn, not from the virus, but when you look, many direct sellers are in developing countries. When you look at how the business model changes there, and you see, for example, Procter & Gamble, big company like that, not a direct seller, initially walked away from countries like India because they said, you know, the average income is so small that we're never going to make a profit. But then they changed their way of thinking and they said, yeah, but if we repackage what we've got, for example, detergent like Ariel, and we sell it in tiny, tiny sachets at a very low cost, instead of big boxes of Ariel or Tide detergent, well, lots, you know, the profit that we make on each of these is going to be pretty tiny. But when millions of people start to buy them, it starts to add up. Before you know it, you're making some money. And so now P&G, Unilever, the big companies like that, that's the way they do business in the so-called bottom of the pyramid. And I think that same lesson can be applied here when we talk about so-called affordable luxury. And you look at a lot of premium brands, whether they're in the direct selling space or not. So for example, a woman may or may not be in a position to spend $200 on Chanel perfume, but she can buy a bar of soap by Chanel for $26. And there are many, many examples of that. And I'm going to come back to that in terms of direct selling in a minute. Mm-hmm. Part of the unfreezing is that we have new social rituals that are occurring. And ritual behavior is very important, by the way, in direct selling, especially with party plans and so on, where people expect certain things to happen at certain times. That's kind of a talk for another day. But when you think about how people are changing their behavior, so for example, Zoom happy hours, we've all probably had our share of those, that creates opportunities, right? Because, for example, when people are on these Zoom calls, they need things to do. We run out of perky chatter after the third or fourth Zoom happy hour, you know? And so when you look, for example, at the notion of sampling your products, If you look on the right here, you see this wine tasting kit for people who are into that. And I know there's a lot of direct sellers in the wine space. Well, think about hosting a virtual wine tasting party, where what you're doing is you're supplying everybody on that call with the samples of wine that they're going to be tasting. And then when it's time to start the call, everybody is again kind of recreating that communal experience that they used to have when they got together. So I think, when you look at direct sellers like these who are selling stuff for the home, I think there's a lot, and others as well. I just picked three that I thought were interesting. When you look at home products, for example, I think there's lots of interesting ways to be creative about how do you repackage what you're selling so that you're sort of doing it in two stages. It's not just a party, but it's a party where people beforehand have gotten, let's say, a kit, not a distributor's kit, but they've gotten a product kit. And now as they go through the call, maybe they have the ability to have a communal experience there. So something to think about there.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I like that Lewin change model and thinking about the unfreeze opportunity that's in front of us to not only think about what people buy, but how people buy. Seems like there's opportunity for direct sellers in really thinking about both of those things. Thinking forward and back to the pandemic specifically, what trends are you seeing right now during this pandemic that stand out to you?
Yeah, when we think about trends, I mean, we have to look at what underlies the trends. Yeah. In other words, what are the drivers of consumer behavior? What are the things that people are striving for? And then we can look secondarily at how they're choosing to satisfy those. So for example, we know that lots of people are buying Peloton bikes that never had them before. Peloton is not the trend. The trend is home wellness, right? The desire to be well at home. Peloton is one way to do that. So when I think about these trends, I like to think about the underlying drivers, the big picture. What are the big things that are keeping people up at night, or that they really want to have during this crazy time? And then we follow in with what are the market opportunities that might be created. So we know that in general, what we want to do is keep our customers engaged. And we know that our customers are pretty distracted. And I don't mean just direct selling customers, all customers are distracted because there's lots of other concerns obviously going on. So how do we do that? How do we get people engaged? And I've talked a lot in other forums and other DSA forums as well about strategies to keep direct selling customers engaged, because that is the crucial link to success, I believe. And so we talk about the direct selling brands. We want to talk about something that I call brand resonance. And that's the extent to which what you're selling connects to people's identities. Because my mantra is we don't buy things because of what they do. We buy them because of what they mean. I say that all the time. I tell my students that. I tell my clients that. And so for your brands, you want to think about what is it that I'm offering that's not just giving people a good product that they can use, but is satisfying some fundamental desire that they have to express some part of their identity, right? So in a sense, the brands that we use kind of become a part of us, like this Michelin ad shows here, one of my favorite ads. And so we can think about, what are the paths to resonance that direct sellers might follow? And, that's a topic for another day. I mean, I could talk for a day about that very easily, but there are a lot of different paths to resonance that I've written about elsewhere. And I talked about a couple of these actually at another DSA event, but just as a reminder, a couple of examples. One of them is what we call personal co-creation. To what extent does my brand actually encourage people to create their own stories about how that brand has impacted their lives? And so here's a direct selling brand. Kevin Guest is one of my favorite direct selling CEOs. We've worked together. And this is what USANA does. They encourage people to tell success stories, as many direct sellers do. So that's an example of creating brand resonance. Another in our checklist of brand resonance is, does my brand have insiders who know details about the history, who know myths about the product creators, and so on? And in the direct selling space, I think that Mary Kay is an obvious one there. Everybody feels like they know the inside details of Mary Kay's story and so on. So that's an indicator that Mary Kay is taking a good, solid step toward brand resonance. In general, having distributors as curators, that is, people who are not just presenting the options, but are actively organizing those options for consumers. That's the way that they become more than just fulfillment people. They become really integral to the customer's life in some way. And I think that's why what we're seeing in general, and this is not just in direct selling, but generally, content creation among marketers. Why is that such an exploding strategy right now? Because people are hungering for not just saying, you know, someone saying, I love brand X, but telling stories about it, posting content, and really engaging. So again, getting your distributors all through the line to really encouraging them to post as much content as they can, especially during this period that we're going through. You know, some other things, and again, I know maybe some direct sellers are doing this, others, from what I've gathered, are not. It's certainly helpful to create a persona of your ideal customer, and you know, there's lots of things we could talk about with regard to that. But basically, if you can't do that, then you're not going to engage that person. If you don't really know who they are, who that ideal customer is, you can't engage them. Another strategy, and I know, again, some direct sellers are doing this, but from what I've gathered, many are not, is what we call customer journey mapping. Very hot topic these days. It's old wine in new bottles. We've been doing it for years, but it's suddenly come to the forefront where, and I think this is really crucial in the direct selling space, the idea is at a very micro level to understand the journey that your customer goes through, and in particular, to identify the pain points that they encounter as they try to either starting from the point where they first learn about the direct seller all the way through to where they're trying to get the products delivered. And we've talked in some, I know there have been some DSA and DSEF meetings about this. You know, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. If you get people to do the orders, but then they get frustrated with the fulfillment, for example, then you might as well not have bothered. So customer journey mapping, if you're not doing that, and I don't just mean you start and then you finish, it's a very exacting science where you have to map out every single point of contact between the customer and the company, whether it's with a distributor or with the headquarters, et cetera.
You know, just to stop you, I don't want to get you off track, but it's sort of interesting connecting that to previous webinars we've hosted in the last couple of weeks where we've talked about building your brand on social media and data analytics and AI tools and augmented reality tools and all of that to help you with that customer mapping, customer journey, or at least be effective within it, right? And informed in what you're doing and engaged, so you're not leaving complaints out there or you're not leaving comments out there, you're actually responding. I think that's a fascinating continuing conversation for another day as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it's both qualitative and quantitative. Data is hugely important, but so is the qualitative notion of basically fishing where the fish are. That is, don't sit in your office and imagine what the journey is. Get off your butt, get out there and actually go through the process yourself. And then you'll understand the pain points, I think. So that, you know, that brings me to this issue of the new normal. And I started by saying, let's look at some major drivers that, at least in my opinion, for what it's worth, are really influencing a lot of behaviors right now. And I've thought about this a lot, and that Forbes article you mentioned, I kind of summarized these 3 pillars of the new normal that I've identified. And I'm going to talk about each of them very briefly. Okay. The first is what I'm calling gratification. And gratification basically means we have this need to feel good, right? And that's a fundamental psychological drive. Not as easy to do when we're all having cabin fever, right? And finding ways, we're seeing all these, thousands of people running out to bars and so on. I don't want to even get into that, but obviously there's this tremendous pent up desire to feel good. And yet, how do we accommodate that when we have all these restrictions that we never used to have? Now, part of that is this tension that we feel between work versus play, right? And we know that that's changing. That's a fundamental dichotomy we've had for years. Work is a place we go. Play is when we stay home, or we go out to dinner or something, or to bars. And we know that, of course, that dichotomy is evaporating very quickly. We also know that actually is probably one of the more positive things in the direct selling space, because that channel, that dichotomy has never been as clearly defined for direct sellers as it is for other kinds of marketers. So obviously, part of this is, how do we stay at home and still feel good about ourselves, maybe even get out of our sweatpants now and then. Gary, I'm betting you're wearing sweatpants below your shirt, but I won't make you stand there.
I'll never
So some of the things we can think about, and again, this isn't relevant for everybody who's listening, but anything that you can do that helps people to organize their home environment is obviously very important right now. Sure. Any kind of hacks that, or organizing equipment that you can sell, et cetera. And I'm just going through each of these very, very quickly. I'm happy to go back to them. Some of the winners that I think are in this space, I've written them down here. This isn't complete by any means, but we can see that, things like, well, obviously, alcohol sales are going through the roof, and, online education is becoming very interesting for those of us at universities. Gaming and esports, all of these things should be obvious, but it's helpful to kind of look at them all in one place and say, well, where does my suite of products or services kind of fit in there? The second one I'll talk about quickly is what we call agency. Now, agency in the psychological sense means to have a feeling of control over your outcomes. Very important to people to feel in control. We're in an environment now where, for many of us, we don't have that control. Anything can happen to us on any day. We're afraid to venture out of our homes, and all of that stuff. So, to the extent that we can restore a feeling of agency, we're going to really make a contribution, and I think people are going to gravitate to that. So for example, in the early stages when everybody was hoarding toilet paper, why were they doing that? I think, at least with my psychologist hat on, I don't think it was really because they were running out of toilet paper. I think that, hoarding behavior usually is related to the psychological need for agency, because what it means is I can't control lots of stuff going on out there in the world, but I can at least make sure that my inventory is solid. And so people felt a sense of reassurance just knowing that they had 18,000 cartons or cases of toilet paper, in their closet, which they're probably never going to use in a lifetime. But the psychological value of that, I think was very powerful. How else can we restore agency? So hygiene obviously is hugely important. We know that one thing the pandemic has done is to push us, again, something that's been accelerated, touchless checkout, self-checkout, and so on is incredibly important right now. But more generally, I think there's something going on that I've called inventory awareness. And that is, I think, any products that help you to keep track of what you have. And I mean that in the physical sense. For example, a smart refrigerator like this that lets you know when you're low on milk, for example. It can be various kinds of dashboards, like financial dashboards, but also health and wellness sorts of dashboards that allow people not to be caught unprepared the next time this happens. I think that's very important. So anybody who's listening who offers some kind of dashboard, particularly if you're in the health and wellness space, very important to provide that constant feedback to people, and obviously highlight opportunities to fill in their inventory with your products. But getting a sense that you're in control, I think, is very important. So some of the likely winners I've listed here, again, not rocket science, but telemedicine, disinfectants, organizational products, prepackaged food, for example, so that people don't all have to touch the food, et cetera. So, no more of those communal snack rooms in offices if people go back to their offices. The third pillar I call stability. Kind of similar to agency, but this refers to predictability and just a feeling of familiarity, being able to predict what your life is going to be like from day to day. And what we see in times of instability is that people become more risk averse. So they no longer, for example, maybe they don't want to try new products or new ways of doing things unless there's a substantial benefit to doing so. They're going to choose perhaps to go back to tried and true solutions that worked for them in the past. So when we think about brand loyalty in general, we know that, and I showed you earlier, during the Great Recession, brand loyalty took a huge hit. Yeah. But then, over time, it started to come back, but never really came back to where it was. Maybe this pandemic will accelerate a movement back to brand loyalty. Certainly, when we think about food, for example, we know that comfort food, this is a great way to have a feeling of stability. Mom's meatloaf makes you feel like you're being taken care of or something like that, comfort foods. And so, when you look at sales of items like canned pastas and all those, nasty things we had growing up, SpaghettiOs and so on, sales are going through the roof for exactly this reason. So I like this post from a consumer. One of the first things I grabbed after the pandemic hit was Kraft Easy Cheese, the disgusting orange stuff in a can. But it was one of the foods I ate growing up, so it's a nostalgia thing. So, it's a way, even though these things are nasty, at least they're familiar to you. And so, we've seen the sales data that vindicates that. Nostalgia in general, looking back, I don't know about you guys, but whenever I watch TV, which is only about 18 hours a day now, it still seems strange to me. I say, oh, those people aren't wearing masks in that show. I remember when people didn't used to wear masks. How about that? I think that we're going to see a rise in nostalgia-related products. Nostalgia has always been in normal times, about 10% of advertising uses a nostalgia theme. We're probably going to see more of that now. Something else that we're seeing, and I do a lot of work in the fashion space, in a shift from indulgement to investment. The idea that, for example, fast fashion, which was already having its issues before the virus hit, is really taking a hit now because people aren't looking so much to replace their garments, for example, every other week with cheap new stuff that they get at H&M. There's much more of a focus on buying things, whether it's apparel or home furnishings, that have even an investment value. So there is literally now, there is this site that you see here called Resale, where you can actually go on there, and if you have one of these fancy designer pocketbooks, you can see how much that's worth in the stock market. They already had one for vintage sneakers, by the way. Now you can actually see what your Louis Vuitton handbag is worth. So we're seeing, certainly in fashion and accessories, more of a shift toward value and long-term value. And lastly, what I'll say on this topic, I know I'm kind of going on and on here, how are consumers relating to the companies that they deal with? And again, in terms of stability, we know that people are looking to trust companies. They're looking to reward the companies that are really showing that they have their back. And so anything you can do, and again, it's so important to walk the walk, not just talk the talk, anything to show that you are giving back to your customers, you're giving back to your community, et cetera, is hugely important. So under any circumstances, that's what builds loyalty in the long run. But that kind of relationship focus is even more important in a period where stability, one of those columns, is particularly important. And so people are willing to give their loyalty, you know, maybe even having a tattoo or having their hair cut this way. You know, lots of people have brands tattooed onto their bodies, even Walmart tattoos, you can find these. You may or may not like that as a fashion statement, but when someone gets your brand logo tattooed into their skin, you know, you probably got a loyal customer there, and that's a pretty good sign. So
It's got
you
an
got to
idea.
work really hard. Sorry?
On the top of your head, you turn it into a fashion statement, right?
Absolutely, absolutely.
Kind of the rest of the apple.
Yeah, yeah. So, you know, these are some of the winners there. Basically, corporate social responsibility. Everybody's hearing this, but it is for real. And this is a way to show people that stability is something they can have because the brands that they trust are still out there. They're still doing business and so on. So that's my long-winded answer to your question about trends.
And it's a good one. It's really interesting. It's something I think of that I just heard today and relating it to how people buy, interact, get involved, your agency point. But Major League Baseball is going to, thankfully coming back to us this week, is going to engage an app that allows people watching their games to have input on the piped in crowd noise as the game's happening. That's really sort of fascinating. I don't know what it says to marketers or maybe the gamification of the party plan or something of that sort, but kind of interesting the way you pull people in, the way you involve them.
Yeah, and you know, more broadly, we call that sometimes the IKEA effect. Basically, anytime you involve your customers in the creation of your product, whether you even have a few screws left over at the end, like I do with IKEA, it heightens their engagement. So it's very important. Yeah.
Yes, I have a collection of spare IKEA screws as well.
Yeah.
So at this point, I have another question or two for Mike, but I want to remind people, use that Q&A function. Ask what's on your mind and join the discussion. We want to make this interactive and really get at what you're thinking about the most. But something that's important, an important discussion within the direct selling channel is, you know, making sure that we're not marketing ourselves or opportunity in ways that are inappropriate or ineffective and those kinds of things. What types of marketing are not resonating during the pandemic? What do you see out there that's not working?
Yeah, well, I'll go back to what I was saying about sincerity and trust. I'll give you a great example from early on when this all started back in March. So this is a fast food example, right? So we have McDonald's first. How do they react? Well, you probably saw this. They changed their arches to emphasize social distancing. That really did not go over very well. Here's what, there were a lot of negative posts about this. Here's what one person said: I don't want your cute logo play, McDonald's. I want you offering 1 million free meals to those in need. I want you turning your drive-through into safe testing sites. Now, you compare that to something that Burger King did at about the same time. So, for example, in France, Burger King does this promotion where they show people how they can make a Whopper at home, which was kind of fun. But they also did what this person asked McDonald's to do. They actually gave out free meals to kids during that time. And I think this juxtaposition is great because what it shows you is, as I said earlier, it's great to talk the talk, but consumers have a BS detector that works really well. And what we're seeing now is a lot of companies that are taking out all these ads about, you know, we're with you, we got your back and all that, whatever the issue is. But the reality is you can very quickly, with a quick Google, you can find umpteen examples of how they're not doing that. And so that is the single most important piece of advice I could give is to make that commitment to social justice, to community and so on. But if you're going to go down that path, you better make sure that you can back it up because it will backfire and you will regret that. Right. And so, what we're seeing is, ironically, when we look at companies and people's trust in government right now, regardless of your political affiliation, we know is extremely low. When you look at surveys like this, it's really an eye-opener because what you're saying is that more people believe that companies can solve the problems that we have than governments. And so increasingly, people are looking to the brands they do business with to take a proactive stand about whatever that issue happens to be. Now, a lot of those issues, and I know in direct selling, there's been a lot of great talk about sustainability, for example. A lot of that has had to do in the past with, and rightfully so, a focus on the environment, manufacturing processes, and so on. It's important to remember that sustainability is a very loaded term. Everybody loves to throw it out there. Usually what they mean is, we're making something that you can recycle. So there's a focus on the planet part of sustainability. But sustainability also embraces other things. It embraces value creation in general. And the third piece that we haven't seen so much of until recently is the focus on people. And increasingly, what customers are looking for is and I'm not saying don't recycle and all that, that's keep up that, right? But that third pillar there, a focus on how do you treat your people, how do you treat your distributors, whether it's health and safety issues. Obviously, diversity and inclusion is a hot button right now. These are the kinds of things that consumers are going to be looking for. So again, when you do your marketing, these should be the things that you're focusing on internally, but make sure you've got your ducks in a row. And then, as they say in public relations, do good and then talk about it. But don't talk about it unless you've actually done it. So that would be my best piece of advice. So those are kind of my three pillars of the new normal. You can think of it as an acronym, stepping on the gas, GAS. And I know you maybe have some other questions for me, but let me just get this in. As I said earlier, if anyone's interested in the book that I mentioned, by all means, drop me an email. You see it here. And we'll be more than happy to send you an ebook, and I'd love to get your feedback on it. So, Gary, I don't know if you have another question for me. Or
I do, and before I do, let's talk about the book a second, because it's fascinating, and you talk about these things often, but your book is really focused on helping marketing professionals better understand many of the assumptions they're making, and a lot of the assumptions we're making are outdated or just flat wrong. Talk a little more about the book and kind of break through that.
Well, essentially what I'm talking about are some of the tried and true ways. The way our brains work is we always put things into categories, good or bad, direct seller or not. We love to put things into categories. And these categories can be self-defeating when they no longer work. So I talk about a lot of those. For example, market segmentation, which everybody on this call is familiar with. A lot of the ways that we teach our students to do this too, so mea culpa, we like to talk about segmenting, for example, by gender, male versus female, or by income, or social class, or region of the country, et cetera. In our postmodern society, and I can talk about what I mean by that on another time, but basically what that means is that we have become so fragmented in terms of our culture and our technology that it often doesn't make sense to talk about large homogeneous market segments, particularly when we have the ability with technology to literally target markets of one, and that may be a term you've heard before. Right. Every consumer is his or her own market. Now, do they share some things in common with others? Obviously, they do, but they're also different in a lot of ways. And I go into a lot of detail about that. But something as simple, for example, as male versus female. We talk about, companies, direct sellers that sell to men versus women. We know that most sell to women, and we know that most distributors are female. But when you look today, especially at younger people, when you look at how they regard gender, they don't see it in those terms. They see it as a much more fluid concept. And the majority, for example, of Gen Z consumers do not think about themselves or their friends in terms of male versus female. So that's one example. It creates a lot of interesting opportunities because in some ways, for example, it helps to expand your market. One obvious thing is just to sell to more men than you're doing now. But there are lots of different ways to talk about market segmentation where our traditional assumptions, back in the old days, right, in the 1950s and 60s, obviously we had in the US 3 or 4 network stations. We could reach everybody You know, if you advertise on Ed Sullivan, you reached everybody. Half the people listening don't know who Ed Sullivan is, but Gary, I think you do. Today, obviously, that's not the case. And so in this postmodern world, when I say tear down these walls, the walls refer to the walls that marketers have created where they feel like if they put their customers into a tidy little category like urban female, that they understand that customer. And that is not the case anymore.
And does that play into the whole mapping conversation and the rest that you?
Absolutely. You know, every journey is individual. Again, does it share characteristics? Yes, it does. But everybody's journey is an individual one.
Right.
And with the technology that we have, for better or worse, we can track everybody, right? There's a lot of ethical issues tied up in that. But the fact is that we know what everybody is doing all the time. Yeah. So we no longer need to be like General Motors, who invented the concept of market segmentation back in the day when they figured out you've got people who can afford a Cadillac and other people who can afford a Chevrolet. Today, everybody's going to personalize their car, so to speak.
Sure, sure. So I have another question. I want to encourage our participants to use the Q&A function to ask their own as well. It's been a fascinating conversation, and we're kind of bumping up against our time. But going back to the Forbes article that you wrote relatively early, in the current crisis for sure. Has anything arisen since that article, whether it's with regard to the pillars or, I don't know, rebound purchasing, resiliency, that you've seen that surprised you?
Well, there's obviously been an uptick in certain types of categories like home improvement and so on, and in wellness products. You know, I know that the direct selling space is actually doing pretty well. And, you know, so it's not across the board that people aren't spending. That's something that surprised me. Frankly, I'm a little surprised at the amount of retail spending that's been going on. And apparently it's because a lot of people, maybe unfortunately, are spending that stimulus money that they got instead of saving it. And so, you know, there's a lot of talk now about coming up now that money is running out, at least as of today. Perhaps that's going to dip down again. But what's been interesting is that this is not by any means an across the board disaster. It's actually created those opportunities that I was referring to in different categories.
Yeah, interesting. So Joe Mariano from DSA and the foundation is with us as well. Joe, you had a question?
I do, and thanks, Gary. And hi, Dr. Solomon. It's good to see you again. We were chatting just before the webinar, and we were chatting, as it happens, about Ronald Reagan. And as I look at your book, I don't know if you meant it or not, but Ronald Reagan said, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." So you've got that kind of connection.
It's a history test to see how old you are, Joe.
Yeah. Well, between Ronald Reagan and Ed Sullivan, I think we've covered the field,
yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Here's the question, there, Dr. Solomon. You know, at the beginning of this crisis, as Gary and I and the teams at DSA and DSEF were working on this, one of the things, as we said, we wanted, from an association and foundation perspective, to make this about all COVID all the time, right? And I suspect that since that time, a lot of companies have done the same thing in terms of their marketing and other efforts. At what point, though, does that become problematic, mundane, boring? And at what point do you return to sort of the old normal in terms of your marketing, and you just talk about your product? Or does that somehow seem out of place when you do it?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think it's a very fine line you got to walk, because you can't be tone deaf and pretend that it's not going on. But people, you know, are getting tired of hearing about it. And obviously what's happened in the last month or two, you know, is that the focus, it's not that the focus has shifted away, but now we have the added focus of social justice and protests and all that kind of stuff. I think, you know, what I was saying is, you know, talk the talk, but also walk the walk. So keep up talking about how you're dealing with COVID, but don't just talk about it, because people are tired of hearing about it. What they want to see are concrete things that you're doing. So get away from the slogans, get away from the "we have your back," you know, all that, and focus more on, look, advertising is basically storytelling. Marketing is storytelling. People want a narrative about a brand. They want to know the story behind the brand. That's why Mary Kay, I think, is so successful, because people personify, you know, Mary Kay there. They have something they can hold on to. So what people want to see is a story. They want to see a story that has a beginning and an end, and the end maybe has a moral to it. But they want to see it concretely. They don't want to see just words on a screen. They want to see, for example, you know, you might want to focus on specific distributors and things that they're doing with their customers or with their downline or whatever it is that are helping people to cope with this, rather than just platitudes. So what I would say is keep it up, but keep it as concrete as possible and stay away from the slogans.
Micah, if I could ask you to take down your slide. We're going to put up a DSEF slide here in a minute as we begin to wrap up. It's really, really great conversation and interesting stuff. And I think as you've referred to a time or two, and I would reiterate, there's a lot of this conversation that could go much deeper and much further. And I know several of the things that you've spoken about have come into conversations with you and fellow DSEF fellow colleagues in terms of further research opportunities. So I would encourage companies to keep an eye out, DSA members to keep an eye out for the research that we're doing with our fellows, but also to participate in that research, make data available so that we can really take those deep dives, those deep looks, and provide not only insight and information to your company that's going to help your company, but also anonymize that story and tell the story of direct selling more broadly in a way that's supportive to the industry. So I just want to thank you for all you've done with us along this journey with the foundation, about 3 years or so that we've been able to work together, and look forward to continuing that together. And this conversation was fantastic. And I want to remind everybody that it was recorded, and like all Engage content and DSEF Insight content, forgive me, those recordings are available through the DSA and DSEF websites. We encourage you to share those with your colleagues on your teams and with your sales force. I think a lot of this is really good material and interesting for Salesforce as well. The current slide, I just want to remind you that DSEF exists on voluntary contributions, so we encourage you to consider supporting the foundation and our work with our fellows in doing research to tell the story of the industry and to reach hundreds of thousands of students and help them understand how the channel works, what direct selling is, where the opportunities are, and how it fits into their broader view of business and opportunity. So again, thank you all so much for being with us. Go to that DSA website and look for those other events. Sign up and be a part of the conversation. Take care of yourselves. Have a good rest of your week and a great weekend. Thank you.